Have you ever noticed that before everything changes, something strange happens? Not something loud or dramatic, but subtle enough that most people brush it off. It's like the universe gives a warning, but almost no one pays attention. Life looks normal on the surface, yet inside, something feels slightly misaligned, as if reality paused for a brief second without explaining why. The truth is, you've already seen this happen before. You've felt that quiet shift, that moment where things didn't fully make sense anymore. But at the time, you didn't connect the dots. You moved on, you adapted, you told yourself it was nothing. And what if it's about to happen again? What if this feeling you've been carrying isn't random stress or imagination, but a signal, a pattern repeating itself right before movement begins? This moment doesn't announce itself clearly. It waits to see if you're aware enough to notice. If something in you has been paying closer attention lately, this isn't new territory. It's familiar for a reason. Something is already shifting, and the noticing is where it begins. At first, it doesn't announce itself. There's no dramatic moment, no clear reason. It begins quietly, almost politely. You're going through your day the same way you always do, surrounded by familiar sounds, familiar conversations, familiar routines. Yet something feels off, not loud, not chaotic, just hollow. The silence starts to feel louder than any noise around you. You notice it in small moments. Someone is talking, maybe even about something important, but the words don't quite land. You hear them, but they don't register the way they used to. It's as if your attention is standing a few steps behind your body, watching instead of participating. You're present, but not fully inside the moment. And that absence begins to echo. This kind of silence isn't about being alone. It can happen in a crowded room. In fact, it often does. You might be surrounded by people, laughter, movement, yet feel strangely untouched by it all. The world keeps making sound, but something inside you has turned the volume down. Not because you're numb, but because you're listening for something else, even if you don't know that yet. What makes this unsettling is that nothing is obviously wrong. Your life may look fine from the outside. The routines still work. The responsibilities are still there. You still show up. But internally there's a pause, a gap, a sense that the usual noise no longer fills you the way it once did. The things that used to distract you now feel thin, almost transparent. You might try to fix it at first. You tell yourself you're just tired or bored or stressed. You reach for more stimulation, more information, more conversation, more activity. But the more you add, the clearer it becomes that this silence isn't asking to be filled. It's asking to be noticed. This is where many people get uncomfortable. Silence has a way of removing the background music we didn't realize we depended on. Without it, you start to hear subtler things, your own thoughts, your own resistance, the questions you've been postponing, the feelings you've been managing instead of understanding. The silence doesn't create these things. It reveals them. There's often a sense that something is in the air, though you can't name it. Time may feel slightly stretched, like it's slowing down just enough for you to notice each moment passing. Waiting rooms feel longer. Evenings feel quieter. You may find yourself staring out of windows more than usual, not because you're thinking about something specific, but because your attention is loosening its grip on the old rhythm. This is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that your inner system is recalibrating. Before any real change takes shape, there is often a withdrawal of noise, a clearing. The mind reduces its constant commentary. The environment feels less engaging. It's like the pause before a deep breath, when everything suspends for a second longer than expected. What's important here is not to rush past this moment. Silence can feel threatening because it doesn't offer immediate answers. It doesn't tell you what to do next. It simply holds space. And in that space, you begin to notice where your energy actually goes. What truly holds your attention? What no longer does? You may realize that certain conversations feel repetitive, even draining, not because the people are wrong, but because you've outgrown the frequency of the exchange. You may notice that your reactions are slower, more measured, or that you don't react at all where you once would have. This isn't indifference, it's distance, a natural step back that allows you to see the whole picture instead of being caught inside it. The silence can feel heavy at times, almost like waiting for something to happen, and in a way, you are. But not in the way you've been taught to wait. This isn't about anticipation or anxiety, it's about readiness. The world feels quieter because the next movement hasn't started yet. The current chapter is winding down, even if the next one hasn't revealed itself. If you listen closely, you might sense that this quiet isn't empty at all. It's full of potential, like a field before planting, like the stillness before weather changes. The noise drops because the system needs less interference to shift direction. And that's why forcing momentum during this phase often feels exhausting. Things require more effort, conversations stall, progress feels delayed. This is where confusion can begin to creep in. You may start wondering why things that once flowed easily now require so much energy, why simple actions feel heavier, why the usual signals of progress are missing. But this silence isn't a blockage, it's a pause, and pauses have a purpose. As this quiet continues, you may notice that not only is the world less noisy, but movement itself starts to slow. Emails don't get answered as quickly. Plans hang in the air. Decisions feel suspended. It's subtle at first, but unmistakable. The silence doesn't just surround you anymore. It begins to show up in how things move forward, or don't. After the quiet settles in, something else begins to stand out. It's not dramatic at first. In fact, it can be so subtle that you almost blame yourself for noticing it. Things that used to move with ease start to hesitate. What once felt natural now feels delayed, interrupted, or oddly resistant. You push, but the response is slower than expected. Sometimes there's no response at all. You might notice this in your work. A project that was moving forward suddenly loses momentum. Emails go unanswered. Decisions get postponed. Meetings don't lead anywhere. You double-check your effort, your tone, your timing. Everything seems fine, yet nothing clicks the way it used to. It feels like pressing the gas pedal and realizing the engine isn't responding. This can also show up in your body. Energy dips for no clear reason. You wake up feeling heavier, even after rest. Motivation doesn't disappear completely, but it becomes inconsistent. You start and stop. You hesitate where you once moved confidently, and the most frustrating part is that there's no clear explanation. Nothing is wrong, yet nothing is flowing. At this point, many people turn inward with criticism. You might ask yourself if you've lost discipline, focus, or drive. You may wonder if you missed an opportunity or made a wrong choice somewhere along the way. The mind looks for mistakes because it wants to fix the problem. But what if this isn't a problem to fix? When flow stalls, it often means the direction that once made sense is no longer aligned in the same way. The system hasn't failed, it's recalibrating. But because we're taught that forward motion should always be smooth, any pause feels like personal failure. We confuse resistance with inadequacy. Think about how nature works. Rivers slow before they change course. Weather shifts before storms form. Growth doesn't happen in a straight line. There are seasons of expansion and seasons of holding. What you're experiencing isn't punishment or regression. It's a signal that the conditions are changing. What makes this phase uncomfortable is that effort no longer guarantees results. You can do all the right things and still feel like you're walking through invisible resistance. This is where frustration builds. You try harder, but the harder you push, the more tired you become. The usual strategies don't work because they were designed for a different phase of movement. Emotionally, this can create doubt. You might feel disconnected from your sense of purpose. Not lost exactly, but unanchored. The goals that once motivated you now feel distant or strangely irrelevant. You don't necessarily want something else yet, but you can feel that what you've been chasing no longer fits the same way. This is where many people misinterpret what's happening. They assume the stall means they should quit everything or force a radical change. But a stall doesn't ask for dramatic action. It asks for attention. It's an invitation to notice where effort is being applied out of habit rather than clarity. There's also a strange emotional tension here. On one hand, you feel pressure to keep things moving, to maintain progress, to avoid falling behind. On the other hand, something deeper in you resists that push. It's as if an inner brake has been applied without your conscious permission. That break isn't there to stop you forever. It's there to prevent you from speeding in the wrong direction. You may notice that even conversations feel slower, responses are delayed, agreements remain vague, people seem distracted or unavailable. Again, it's tempting to take this personally. But often, it's not about you at all. It's about timing. The field around you is reorganizing, and during reorganization, movement becomes inefficient by design. This phase tests your relationship with control. When things flow, it's easy to trust life. When they stall, trust feels risky. You want guarantees, timelines, reassurance, but none of that is available right now. What is available is information, though it doesn't come in the form you're used to. Pay attention to what consistently stalls versus what still moves, even slightly. There's meaning there. Some doors resist no matter how often you knock. Others open quietly without effort. The stall is not random, it's selective. It highlights what no longer matches your internal state, even if your mind hasn't caught up yet. You might also start noticing a pattern in what stops working. Certain types of tasks, certain kinds of relationships, certain emotional reactions, the same friction appearing in different areas of life. At first it feels inconvenient, then confusing. Eventually, if you stay with it, it becomes revealing. This is where awareness begins to sharpen. The stall creates space for observation. Without constant motion, you can finally see what keeps repeating beneath the surface. The same themes, the same dynamics, the same loops showing up in new disguises. And once you start seeing those repetitions, it becomes harder to ignore that something deeper is asking to be acknowledged. Once movement slows and the usual momentum fades, your attention naturally turns inward, and that's when something becomes harder to ignore. Similar situations begin to show up again and again, almost as if life is replaying the same scene with different actors. At first you brush it off as coincidence, then it happens again and again. Different day, different context, same emotional outcome. You may notice this in conversations. You keep having variations of the same discussion, even with different people. The words change, the setting changes, but the feeling at the end is familiar. Maybe it's frustration, or disappointment, or the sense of not being fully seen. It's subtle, but unmistakable. Something keeps circling back. This can also appear in your choices. You think you're choosing something new, but the result feels oddly familiar. The same type of obstacle shows up, the same kind of delay, the same tension between what you want and what actually happens. It's as if life is holding up a mirror and asking, do you see it now? What makes repeating patterns uncomfortable is that they challenge the idea that everything is happening to you. Patterns suggest participation, not blame, but involvement. They hint that there is something internal interacting with the external world in a consistent way. And noticing that can feel destabilizing, especially if you've worked hard to move on from the past. You might feel a mix of curiosity and resistance. Part of you wants to understand why this keeps happening. Another part is tired of thinking about it. You may say to yourself, I've already dealt with this, or I thought I was past that. But patterns don't return to punish. They return to clarify. Often the pattern isn't about the surface event, it's about the response, the way you interpret, the way you adjust yourself to fit the situation, the way you stay silent or push or wait. Life doesn't repeat details, it repeats themes, and themes are easier to miss if you're only looking at appearances. As this becomes more visible, time itself can feel layered. Past and present seem to overlap. Old emotions resurface without clear triggers. Memories you thought were settled suddenly carry weight again. It's not regression, it's integration. Something unresolved is asking for a different kind of attention than it received before. You may start noticing these repetitions, not just emotionally but symbolically. The same words appearing in different places, similar scenarios unfolding in unrelated areas of life, work reflecting personal dynamics, relationships mirroring internal conflicts. It can feel uncanny, as if reality is gently tapping you on the shoulder. At this stage, the mind often tries to analyze its way out. You look for logical explanations. You connect dots intellectually. While that can be helpful, it's rarely sufficient. Patterns aren't solved by thinking alone. They're understood through observation, through watching your own reactions without immediately trying to change them. There's a quiet shift that happens when you stop asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" and start asking, "What stays the same in me when this happens?" That question isn't accusatory, it's revealing. It opens space instead of closing it. You may realize that certain roles you play are deeply ingrained: the fixer, the listener, the one who adapts, the one who holds things together. These roles often formed for good reasons. They helped you survive, connect, belong. But over time they can become automatic, running in the background without your consent. As awareness grows, the pattern begins to lose some of its power, not because it disappears, but because you're no longer fully inside it. You start noticing the moment it activates, the familiar tightening in the body, the predictable emotional arc, the internal dialogue that follows. This noticing creates distance, and distance creates choice. What's interesting is that as soon as you see a pattern clearly, life tends to present it again almost immediately, not as a test, but as an opportunity, a chance to respond slightly differently, to pause where you would normally react, to listen instead of assume, to speak instead of retreat. This is where timing becomes important. These repetitions often intensify right before a larger shift. It's as if the system is saying, "This is the last unresolved loop. Pay attention." The closer you get to change, the clearer the pattern becomes. It steps into the foreground so it can't be ignored. You may also notice that these patterns aren't isolated to one area. They echo across different parts of your life. What happens in your internal world reflects externally, and vice versa. This can feel overwhelming at first, like everything is connected all at once, but it's also clarifying. It shows you where your energy has been cycling instead of moving forward. As these repetitions become undeniable, something else begins to happen. You start seeing connections, not just in situations, but in the environment around you. Small details line up: numbers, symbols, phrases, timing. It feels like the pattern is no longer just internal. It's starting to leave markers in the world around you, quietly pointing in the same direction. At some point, the repetitions stop feeling confined to your inner world. They begin to show up outside of you, scattered through ordinary moments in ways that are hard to dismiss. You glance at the clock and see the same numbers again. A phrase you were just thinking about appears in a conversation, a book, a headline, an image, an animal, a symbol crosses your path more than once in a short span of time. At first, you tell yourself it's random, then it keeps happening. What makes this different from simple coincidence is not the sign itself, but the timing. These moments seem to arrive precisely when your mind is quiet enough to notice them. They don't interrupt your day loudly. They slip in softly, almost politely, as if waiting to see whether you're paying attention or not. You might feel a slight pause inside when it happens, a subtle sense of recognition. Not excitement, not fear, just a brief inner stillness. Something in you registers meaning before your thoughts catch up. And then the mind steps in, trying to explain it away. You remind yourself that the brain looks for patterns, that numbers repeat all the time, that symbols are everywhere if you're looking for them. And yet, you weren't looking. That's the part that lingers. These signs don't usually point to specific outcomes. They don't tell you what will happen or what choice to make. Instead, they seem to underline a moment. They highlight awareness itself. It's as if reality is saying, "Notice where you are right now." The message isn't external, it's reflective. As this continues, your relationship with attention begins to shift. You find yourself moving through the day with a softer focus, less rushing, more noticing. Not because you're trying to be mindful, but because something keeps drawing your awareness back to the present moment. The world feels slightly more alive, slightly more responsive. You may start to question what a sign really is. Is it guidance from outside, or is it feedback from within? The line between the two becomes less clear. What matters is not the source, but the effect. These moments pull you out of autopilot. They interrupt the usual mental noise just long enough for you to feel grounded in the now. At times, this can feel comforting. At other times, unsettling. Because noticing signs means accepting that something is shifting beneath the surface, even if you can't yet name it. It suggests that you're no longer fully asleep inside your routines, and once that awareness begins, it's difficult to turn it off. You might also notice that these signs tend to appear during transitions, while walking, while driving, in the quiet between tasks. Rarely when you're forcing answers. They show up in the in-between spaces, when control loosens and perception opens. That's not accidental. There's also a subtle emotional layer to this. Along with curiosity, there may be a sense of being watched over or accompanied, not in a dramatic or mystical way, but in a grounding one, as if you're not navigating this shift alone, even if no one around you seems to understand what you're experiencing. At the same time, doubt can creep in. You may worry that you're reading too much into things, that you're projecting meaning where there is none. This skepticism is natural. It keeps you balanced. The point isn't to believe everything you notice. It's to stay present with the noticing itself. Because the real change isn't happening in the signs, it's happening in you. You're becoming more sensitive to subtle information, to patterns of timing, to the way your inner state interacts with the world around you. This sensitivity isn't about becoming special or chosen. It's about becoming available to perceive layers of experience that were always there, but filtered out by constant mental noise. As awareness sharpens, the signs may feel closer together, almost clustered. One after another, small and ordinary, yet strangely connected. It can feel like reality is gently nudging you forward without pushing, inviting you to stay awake just a little longer. But this increased awareness comes with a side effect. As you notice more, you may begin to feel less anchored in your usual sense of self. The roles, identities, and environments that once defined you start to feel slightly unfamiliar. Not wrong, just less solid, like clothes that no longer fit the same way. You might feel this most strongly in moments of stillness, a subtle sense that you're standing between versions of yourself, no longer fully who you were, not yet sure who you're becoming. The signs don't resolve this feeling, they accompany it. And as they continue to appear, quietly and persistently, another sensation begins to grow beneath your awareness. A feeling that you're not quite where you belong anymore, that your inner space has expanded while your outer life hasn't caught up yet. A gentle, disorienting sense of being slightly out of place, even in familiar surroundings. At first, the feeling is vague, easy to dismiss. You tell yourself you're just tired, distracted, maybe overwhelmed. But over time, it becomes harder to ignore. There's a growing sense that you don't fully fit where you are anymore, not just physically, but energetically. As if your inner world has shifted a few degrees, while your outer life stayed the same. You notice it in familiar places. Rooms you've been in 1,000 times suddenly feel different. Not hostile, not uncomfortable, just strangely neutral. The emotional charge they once carried has faded. You're there, but you don't feel anchored in the same way. It's like standing in a place you recognize, but no longer identify with. This feeling can be unsettling because it doesn't come with clear instructions. There's no obvious place to go instead. No alternative waiting neatly on the horizon. You just know that something inside you has moved, and the environment around you hasn't caught up yet. You may feel this most strongly in social situations. Conversations that used to feel natural now require more effort. Small talk feels heavier. Certain jokes don't land the same way. You laugh, but something inside stays quiet. It's not judgment, it's distance. A subtle awareness that you're no longer tuned to the same frequency. This can bring a sense of loneliness, even when you're not alone. Not the kind that comes from lack of connection, but the kind that comes from internal change. You're becoming someone new, but you're still surrounded by reflections of who you used to be. That gap creates tension. You might also notice this displacement in your body, a restlessness that has no clear outlet, a sense of being slightly off balance even when nothing is wrong. You move through your day with a quiet awareness of yourself, as if you're observing your own movements from a step back. Not dissociated, just less merged with the moment. This state can feel confusing because it's not dramatic. There's no breakdown, no crisis. Life continues. You function. You meet responsibilities. But beneath it all, There's a persistent sense that you're standing on shifting ground. Part of you may want to escape this feeling, to travel, to change routines, to rearrange your environment. And while small changes can help, they rarely resolve the deeper displacement. Because this isn't about location, it's about orientation. You're reorienting internally. Your values are adjusting. Your attention is reorganizing. What matters is being quietly redefined. And until the outer world reflects that shift, there will be a mismatch. This is often the point where people try to force clarity. You might ask yourself big questions, searching for immediate answers. What do I really want? What's my next step? What's wrong with where I am? But the answers don't come easily. Not because they're being withheld, but because the question itself is still forming. There's a tenderness to this phase that often goes unrecognized. You're in between identities. The old one no longer fits, but the new one hasn't fully emerged. That in-between space can feel unstable, even though it's deeply creative. Something new is organizing itself quietly, beneath conscious thought. You may notice that your tolerance for certain situations decreases. Environments that once felt manageable now feel draining. Not because they're worse, but because you're more sensitive. Your system is less willing to override discomfort just to maintain familiarity. This can lead to subtle withdrawals. You show up less. You speak less. You conserve energy without fully realizing why. At the same time, moments of alignment feel stronger. When something does resonate, it stands out sharply. A conversation that feels real. A moment of silence that feels nourishing. A place that feels calm instead of dull. These moments act like brief anchors, reminding you that this displacement isn't emptiness, it's transition. There can also be a quiet grief here, not always conscious, but present. You're letting go of ways of being that once defined you. Even if they no longer fit, they still mattered. And releasing them creates space, but also absence. As this sense of displacement deepens, you may notice subtle shifts in how others respond to you. Without you saying anything, dynamics begin to change. Some people seem less engaged, others more curious. Some interactions feel strained without a clear reason. It's as if your internal movement is creating ripples outward, gently rearranging the relational field around you. You haven't done anything differently. You haven't announced a change. But something in your presence has shifted, and others, consciously or not, begin to respond to that difference. At first, you wonder if you're imagining it. No one has said anything directly. There hasn't been a confrontation or a clear moment of change. And yet, something feels different in the way people interact with you. The tone shifts, the timing changes. The energy of certain relationships subtly rearranges itself without explanation. Some people begin to pull back. Not dramatically, not with conflict, just with distance. Messages take longer to arrive. Invitations slow down. Conversations stay on the surface. You may replay past interactions in your mind, trying to figure out what you did wrong. But nothing stands out. There was no mistake. There was just a shift. At the same time, others respond in the opposite way. They seem drawn to you, sometimes unexpectedly. They open up more quickly. They ask deeper questions. They linger in conversations that once would have ended sooner. It can feel confusing to experience both at once. Distance from some, intensity from others. What's happening isn't about behavior, it's about resonance. As your inner state changes, your presence changes with it. Even if you haven't altered your words or actions, people sense something different. Humans are deeply attuned to subtle cues: tone, pacing, attention, emotional availability. When those shift, relationships adjust automatically. This can feel uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that connection is fully under our control. You may want to hold things steady, to keep relationships as they were. But connection isn't static. It responds to who you are becoming, not who you've been. For those who drift away, it often has less to do with rejection and more to do with misalignment. The relationship was anchored in a version of you that is no longer fully present. Without that familiar dynamic, there's less to hold it together. This can feel like loss even when no one has done anything wrong. You might feel a quiet sadness about this, a sense of something dissolving without closure. There's no argument to point to, No reason to explain, just a gradual fading. And because it's subtle, it can be harder to grieve. It leaves you with questions instead of answers. With those who draw closer, there can be a different kind of discomfort. Their intensity may feel sudden. You might not feel ready to be seen in this new in-between state. You may still be figuring yourself out, and their attention feels like a spotlight you didn't ask for. This creates an internal tension. Part of you wants to retreat, to stabilize before engaging. Another part recognizes that these interactions feel more honest, more alive. They touch something real, even if it's tender. As this continues, you may become more aware of how much energy certain interactions require. Some leave you drained, even if they're familiar. Others leave you clear, even if they're new. This awareness isn't judgment. It's information. Your system is learning to read signals it once ignored. You may also notice that people project onto you differently. Some see you as distant, even if you don't feel that way. Others see depth or calm where you feel uncertainty. This mismatch can feel strange, like being misunderstood in opposite directions at the same time. What's important to remember is that this phase often brings relational sorting, not in a dramatic final way, but in a gradual reorganization. The roles you played in certain relationships may no longer be available. The listener, the fixer, the one who adapts. Without those roles, the dynamic has to change. This can be unsettling because roles offer safety. They tell us who we are in relation to others. When those roles dissolve, identity feels less stable. You may ask yourself who you are now, without the familiar scripts. There can also be moments of unexpected honesty. Someone may say something that surprises you, a comment that reveals how they've been experiencing you. It might not match how you see yourself, but it offers a glimpse into how your presence has shifted. This phase requires patience, even when clarity is missing. Trying to force relationships back into old shapes usually creates more friction. The changes you're experiencing aren't problems to solve. They're signals of internal movement, finding external expression. As people respond differently to you, another process quietly unfolds. Their reactions become mirrors. Through them, you begin to question not just who you're connected to, but what you believe about yourself. Old assumptions start to feel less solid. Certainties you once stood on begin to wobble. And without realizing it, the questions turn inward, toward the beliefs that have been guiding you for years. It doesn't happen all at once. There's no single moment where everything you believed suddenly collapses. Instead, it begins quietly, almost politely. A thought crosses your mind and doesn't settle the way it used to. An opinion you once held with confidence now feels less solid. You notice yourself pausing before agreeing with ideas that once felt obvious. At first, you might resist this. Questioning long-held beliefs can feel disorienting, even threatening. Beliefs aren't just ideas, they're anchors. They shape how you make sense of the world, how you justify your choices, how you see yourself. When those anchors loosen, the ground feels less stable. You may notice this in everyday situations. Advice that once sounded wise now feels incomplete. Rules you lived by start to feel narrow. Even personal stories you've told about yourself for years begin to sound rehearsed, as if they no longer capture who you are becoming. This isn't about becoming cynical or rejecting everything. It's about sensitivity. You're noticing inconsistencies that were always there but filtered out by certainty. What once felt black and white now reveals layers. Nuance replaces conviction, and that can be uncomfortable. You might find yourself questioning success, for example. What does it really mean? Is it achievement, stability, recognition? Or is it alignment, clarity, peace? Answers that once felt universal now feel personal. And personal answers are harder to defend because they don't come with guarantees. You may also question ideas about relationships. What does connection actually require? Effort, loyalty, sacrifice, freedom. You might realize that some beliefs you carried were inherited rather than chosen, absorbed from family, culture, or circumstance, not examined through lived experience. As this questioning deepens, it can feel like you're dismantling your own foundation. There's a temptation to rush toward new beliefs, just to restore certainty. But this phase doesn't ask for replacement yet. It asks for space. Not knowing becomes part of the experience. And for many people, that's the hardest part. We're taught to value answers, positions, clarity. Sitting with uncertainty can feel like weakness. But here, uncertainty is a sign of honesty. You're no longer forcing conclusions to feel safe. You may notice emotional reactions tied to this questioning: fear, relief, sadness, even guilt, especially if certain beliefs were tied to identity or belonging. Letting go of them can feel like stepping away from a community, a role or a version of yourself that once offered protection. There may also be moments of quiet liberation, when you realize you no longer have to defend something that never fully resonated, when you allow yourself to admit, even silently, "I don't know anymore." That admission can feel like an exhale you didn't realize you were holding. As you question beliefs about the world, you also begin to question beliefs about yourself. Who you thought you were, what you thought you were capable of, what you believed you deserved. Old limits start to feel arbitrary. Old labels feel restrictive. You might notice that your inner dialogue changes. Instead of certainty, there's curiosity. Instead of judgment, there's observation. You catch yourself responding differently to situations that once triggered strong reactions, not because you don't care, but because you're no longer filtering everything through rigid assumptions. This phase can feel lonely. Questioning separates you from certainty, and certainty is often what connects people. Conversations can feel harder when you no longer fully agree, but don't yet know how to articulate what's changed. You may choose silence more often, not out of avoidance, but out of respect for the process unfolding inside you. It's important to recognize that this questioning isn't meant to strip you of meaning. It's meant to refine it. False certainty dissolves so deeper, truth can emerge. But that truth doesn't arrive fully formed. It grows slowly through experience rather than declaration. As beliefs loosen, you may feel a strange vulnerability. Without the armor of certainty, life feels more exposed. Loss feels sharper. Doubt feels closer. You may even feel like you're losing your footing in ways you didn't anticipate, and that's when another fear can surface. Her sense that by questioning everything, you might lose everything. Relationships, direction, stability. The structures you leaned on start to look fragile. And without fully realizing it, the questioning begins to touch something deeper than belief. It touches the fear of loss itself, the sense that everything you know might be slipping away at once. There's a moment when the questioning stops feeling philosophical and starts feeling personal, heavy, close to home. It's the sense that too much is slipping through your fingers at the same time. Not all at once in a dramatic collapse, but piece by piece, quietly, until you look around and realize how much feels uncertain. Things you relied on no longer feel stable. Relationships shift, plans dissolve. Routines that once gave structure now feel fragile or meaningless. Even your sense of direction feels thinner. You may wake up with a subtle anxiety, not tied to any single problem, but to the overall feeling that the ground beneath you is no longer solid. What makes this phase especially difficult is that it doesn't come with clear losses you can point to and explain. It's not always about something ending definitively. It's about things no longer holding the same weight. What once felt essential now feels temporary. What once felt secure now feels conditional. You might tell yourself that you're overreacting, that nothing catastrophic has happened, and objectively that may be true. But emotionally, it feels like erosion, like watching familiar landmarks slowly disappear in the fog. You know they're still there, but you can't see them the way you used to. This can trigger fear in a very primal way. The fear of instability, the fear of being unsupported, the fear of not knowing how to rebuild if everything falls apart. Even if you're capable and resilient, uncertainty has a way of shaking confidence at its roots. You may grieve things that aren't fully gone yet, a relationship that's changed tone, a dream that no longer excites you, a version of yourself that once felt clear and defined. This grief can feel confusing because there's no clear ending to mourn, just a slow realization that something has passed its season. At times, this feeling of loss can turn inward. You might wonder if you're losing yourself, the motivation you once had, the certainty you once carried, the enthusiasm that used to come easily. You may feel less driven, less certain, less sure of who you are becoming. This is often when the mind searches for control. You may feel tempted to hold on tighter, to fix things quickly, to make firm decisions just to stop the bleeding. There's a strong urge to stabilize, even if that means clinging to something that no longer fits. But what's being lost here isn't random. It's selective. The things falling away are often the things that required you to override yourself, the roles you maintained out of obligation, the paths you followed out of habit, the beliefs you upheld out of fear of disruption. Losing them hurts, but keeping them would cost more in the long run. Still, knowing that doesn't make it easy. There can be moments where you feel exposed, almost raw. Without the familiar structures, you're more aware of your vulnerability, of how much you depended on certain outcomes to feel safe. You may notice your tolerance for stress decreases. Small things feel bigger. You feel closer to your limits. This isn't weakness, it's sensitivity. When the old armor comes off, everything is felt more directly. There's also a strange paradox here. Alongside the fear of loss, there may be a quiet sense of relief, not constant, not dominant, but present. A sense that something false is finally loosening its grip. That even though you feel like you're losing everything, you're also being relieved of something heavy. This internal contradiction can be confusing. How can loss and relief coexist? How can something feel both devastating and strangely necessary? The mind struggles to reconcile this because it prefers clean narratives. But transformation rarely follows clean lines. You may find yourself simplifying, pulling back, wanting fewer commitments, fewer explanations, fewer expectations. This isn't withdrawal from life, it's conservation. Your energy is reorganizing, and it needs space to do that. At this stage, it's easy to misinterpret what's happening as failure, to think you've made wrong choices or missed your chance. But this phase isn't about losing your life. It's about losing the scaffolding that once held it together. And when that scaffolding comes down, there's an uncomfortable openness, a sense that anything could happen next, that nothing is fixed anymore. For some, that feels terrifying. For others, it feels like possibility trying to breathe. As the sense of loss settles in, something else begins to stir beneath it. A restlessness, a quiet pressure. Not quite hope, not quite panic, just a growing awareness that staying exactly where you are, internally or externally, is no longer an option. You feel an urge to change, even if you have no idea yet what that change should look like or where it might lead. The urge doesn't arrive with a plan. It shows up as pressure, a restlessness that sits just beneath the surface of everything you do. You can feel it when you wake up, before your thoughts fully form. You can feel it in the middle of conversations, in moments when you should be focused, but your attention keeps drifting somewhere you can't quite name. You know something has to change. That much feels certain. What isn't clear is what that change should be or where it should take you. The old directions don't call to you anymore, but no new path has revealed itself. You're standing between movement and stillness, pulled forward by an invisible force, yet unsure which way to step. This can be one of the most frustrating phases of all. Wanting movement without having direction, feeling ready without knowing for what. You may feel impatient with yourself, as if clarity should have arrived by now. But clarity doesn't come on command. It emerges when the conditions are right. At first, you may try to satisfy this urge externally. You change small things, your schedule, your environment, your habits. You look for something that will settle the feeling. Sometimes it helps briefly, but the restlessness returns because the source isn't outside. It's internal. There's a sense that doing more isn't the answer. In fact, excessive doing can make the discomfort worse. The more you push, the more disconnected you feel. This creates a strange contradiction. You feel driven to change, yet exhausted by action, motivated, yet resistant. This is often when people feel lost, not because there are no options, but because none of the available options feel true. You might look at your life and think, I could keep going like this. But something inside you quietly responds, I can't. What's shifting here isn't circumstance, it's orientation. Your inner compass is recalibrating, and during recalibration, signals are unreliable. Old motivations fade before new ones take shape. You're no longer pulled by what used to excite you, but you haven't yet discovered what will replace it. This phase requires patience, but patience is hard when your nervous system feels activated. You may feel on edge, easily irritated, or unusually sensitive. The urge to move is real, but it's not asking for immediate action, it's asking for attention. Instead of looking outward for answers, you may begin turning inward, almost unintentionally. You notice your reactions more closely. You become aware of what drains you and what doesn't. You start paying attention to how your body responds to certain choices, even small ones. This shift from doing to observing can feel unnatural at first. We're conditioned to solve problems through action. But here, action without awareness only adds noise. Observation creates space. And in that space, something subtle begins to change. You may notice brief moments of clarity that come and go, a sudden insight during a walk, a sentence in a book that feels personal, a quiet realization that arrives without effort. These moments don't last, but they leave an impression. They hint that direction isn't something you force, it's something you allow to surface. There can also be fear here. Fear that if you stop pushing, nothing will happen. Fear that you'll miss your moment. But this phase isn't about missing anything, it's about timing. Movement that comes too early often leads back to the same place. As the urge to change continues, you may feel drawn toward simplicity. Less noise, less explanation, less external input. Not as an escape, but as a way to hear yourself again. The constant pull of information, opinion, and expectation starts to feel overwhelming. You might notice that silence feels different now, less empty, more alive. It becomes a place where something inside you can reorganize without interruption. In these quieter moments, you begin to sense that the change you're seeking isn't about becoming someone else. It's about shedding what no longer belongs. This realization doesn't resolve the restlessness immediately, but it shifts your relationship to it. The urge to change becomes less frantic and more focused, less about escape and more about alignment. And as you stay with this observing stance without rushing to conclusions, a new understanding begins to form. You start to see that everything you've been experiencing, the stalls, the repetitions, the losses, the restlessness, may not be random at all. They begin to look like preparation, like a sequence moving towards something precise, even if it's still just out of view. The realization doesn't arrive as a sudden revelation. There's no dramatic moment where everything clicks at once. Instead, it unfolds quietly, like a pattern slowly coming into focus. You look back at the confusion, the pauses, the discomfort, and for the first time, they begin to make a different kind of sense. What once felt like obstruction now looks more like redirection. The delays, the endings, the moments where nothing seemed to work weren't random interruptions. They were adjustments, subtle ones, necessary ones. Life wasn't pushing against you, it was repositioning you. You begin to see how each phase served a purpose, even if it didn't feel that way while you were inside it. The silence created space. The stalls stopped you from moving too fast in the wrong direction. The repeating patterns highlighted what needed to be seen. The losses cleared room. None of it was wasted. This doesn't mean it was easy or painless. Preparation rarely is. It often feels like confusion because the mind wants clarity before movement, while preparation happens before understanding. You were being changed at a level deeper than strategy or planning. Your perception was being refined. You may notice a shift in how you relate to your past now. Situations that once felt like mistakes no longer carry the same emotional charge. You can see how they shaped you, not as punishments, but as pressures that strengthen discernment. Even the moments you regret begin to look like teachers, not failures. There's also a quiet humility in this realization. You see how little control you actually had, and strangely, that brings relief. You didn't need to force growth, you needed to allow it. The process unfolded through experience, not willpower. As this understanding deepens, you may feel a subtle sense of grounding return, not because everything is resolved, but because you trust the movement now. You're no longer fighting the current, you're aware of it. This trust doesn't come from blind faith, it comes from evidence, from lived experience. You've seen how resistance appeared exactly where alignment was missing. You've seen how what fell away did so at the right moment, even if you didn't agree at the time. You also begin to recognize yourself differently. You're not the same person who entered this process. Your tolerance for noise is lower. Your sensitivity is higher. Your relationship with time has changed. You're less reactive, more observant. Not because you're trying to be, but because the process reshaped you. This awareness brings a sense of readiness. Not urgency, not impatience, just a quiet readiness. Like standing at the edge of something without needing to name it yet. You feel steadier, even in uncertainty. You may also notice that fear has changed. It hasn't disappeared, but it no longer dominates. It's quieter, more informational. It alerts you without paralyzing you. That shift alone tells you something fundamental has changed. Looking back, you can see that you weren't being held back. You were being prepared to see differently, to choose differently, to respond differently. The preparation wasn't about adding skills or knowledge. It was about subtraction, removing what distorted your perception. This is where gratitude can surface, even for the difficult parts, not as a forced positive spin, but as recognition. You understand now that the discomfort had intelligence behind it, that the process was precise. There's also a growing sense of coherence. Things that once felt fragmented begin to connect. Not as a neat story, but as a living sequence. One thing led to another, not by accident, but by necessity. You're not standing at the finish line, there's more ahead, but you're no longer disoriented. You know that whatever comes next will meet you differently, because you are different. And in this steadiness, something subtle but important happens. You stop asking what went wrong and start asking, what am I ready for now? Not with pressure, with curiosity, with presence. The preparation phase doesn't announce its end. It simply gives way to movement. Not forced movement, responsive movement. And as you stand in that readiness, observing rather than rushing, you can feel it building. The sense that the shift you've been sensing all along is no longer approaching. It's already underway. Deep down you already knew. Not as a thought, not as a theory, but as a quiet recognition that's been with you longer than you realized. What changed wasn't the world around you. It was your ability to see it clearly. The pauses, the discomfort, the feeling of being out of place were never signs that something was wrong. They were signs that something was aligning. When you stop running from what you notice and begin to stay with it, reality responds differently. Not louder, clearer. The shift doesn't begin with action. It begins with awareness. And once you truly see, you can't unsee. You move differently. You choose differently. You listen more closely to what feels true instead of what feels familiar. If this spoke to you, write this sentence in the comments. I noticed before it shifted. It lets me know you stayed until the end and that this message reached you. And if you want to go deeper, choose one of the videos on the screen now. They build on this same awareness in a practical and grounded way. If you felt something here, there's more waiting for you.